for coming to our Conservation Cafe this evening. I am Renee Greeby, pronouns she and hers. I'm the Northern Virginia Conservation Advocate for Nature Forward, and we are thrilled tonight to have the pleasure of having Nancy Lawson be the host of tonight's panel discussion about low-impact landscaping in homeowners associations, HOAs. We've got lots of people in the audience tonight from different locales, and the vast majority of you are either from Maryland or Virginia, and we'll be talking about the experiences in both of those states tonight. We're also joined by our Director of Conservation, Lydia Lawrence, tonight, and she and I will be here in the background helping with any of your technical needs. Feel free to use the chat box for that. I want you to do a quick introduction of our host this evening. You've probably read her bio on our website when you registered, but Nancy Lawson is the author of The Humane Gardener, Nurturing a Backyard Habitat for Wildlife, and the recently released Wildscape, Trilling Chipmunks, Beckoning Blooms, Salty Butterflies, and Other Sensory Wonders of Nature. A nature writer, habitat consultant, popular speaker, and founder of the Humane Gardener, LLC, she pioneers creative, wildlife-friendly landscape methods. Her presentations at diverse venues, from national wildlife refuges to local wildflower preserves, have inspired even seasoned horticulturalists and wildlife experts to look at their landscapes in a new way. Certified as a Chesapeake Bay landscape professional and a master naturalist, Nancy co-chairs Howard County Bee City in Maryland and helped launch a community science project, Monarch RX, based on scientific discoveries made in her own garden. Nancy's books, garden advocacy, and scientific endeavors have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, O Magazine, Entomology Today, Ecological Entomology, and numerous podcasts and radio shows. So also, before we dive into the panel discussion, I wanted to do a quick introduction of Nature Forward as well. So at Nature Forward, we inspire residents across the greater DC area region to appreciate, understand, and protect their natural environment through outdoor experiences, education, and advocacy. And we seek to create a larger and more diverse community of people who treasure the natural world and work to preserve it. And I know many of you do just that. So thank you for that. If you're on social media, please chat up this Conservation Cafe tonight. Go Nature Forward is our tag, and is our handle, and our hashtag for tonight is Conservation Cafe. We'd love to have you share this with your friends. I think, as you probably already know, this will be recorded, so this is going to be available to share with folks at a later date. You'll all be getting an email in about a week with the recording. So in terms of participation tonight, it's a webinar, not a Zoom meeting, so you can use the Q&A feature. So this is great. As folks are talking and the panelists are having discussions, please put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat box. And this will allow others to see the questions that you're asking and allow people to upvote those as well, so that we can see what might be a more popular question. But if you also have technical help that you need, like I mentioned, please go ahead and put that in the chat function. And also feel free to discuss things in the chat box as the panelists are discussing things. And with that, I will hand it over to Nancy.
Thank you, Renee. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. This is really exciting.
Can we hear you?
You can't hear me? You can? Or you can't? Can anybody hear me?
We can.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'm just trying to share my screen here. Yeah, so this is a really important topic to do you see my slides? Yay.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. To me personally, I mean, even though I don't live in an HOA community, it's been near and dear to my heart for a long time, going back to when I first started my nature advocacy work, just to try to get people to be more understanding of our wild neighbors. And even back then, I heard horror stories from people who were being cited for having moss in their gardens or leaving pine cones under their pine trees, or, you know, some of these really ridiculous so-called infractions. And it quickly became apparent to me that if I really wanted to help more people start gardening for wildlife, I needed to help them address this in any way that I could contribute. I never would have guessed just how much more personal this would become, but it became really personal in 2017 when my sister and brother-in-law, Janet and Jeff Crouch, were attacked for the gorgeous garden that they had created. The harassment from their HOA was just relentless, and you'll hear about it from Janet tonight. It was also very ignorant. The violation notices could never actually pinpoint anything wrong that they were doing. And Janet and Jeff were just basically harassed for their nefarious plans to help birds and bees. So wildlife friendly people living in these communities sometimes need all the help that they can get from the rest of us. But unfortunately, there's often not a lot of help to be found. And a common reaction to this situation is that I would never live in an HOA. And that's really not fair or reasonable, because a huge percentage of American real estate is tied up in HOAs. Sometimes there's just little other choice for people buying a house in a community. In recent years, nearly 75% of homes sold were part of HOA communities, and almost 75 million Americans live in HOAs. And that just adds up to a lot of people, but it represents a chance for us to transform a significant portion of land to wildlife-friendly landscaping, if only we do keep fighting back on these ridiculous restrictions. Now, there's no one cookie cutter situation that people are going to encounter, because every homeowners association is different. And so generally speaking, this is the dividing line. You know, you can be in a community where people on the board are reasonable enough, but maybe they just don't know about the subject matter. So outreach and talking to them can help. Or you can be dealing with unreasonable people who are on the board for, you know, reasons that are not in the community's best interest, whether it's power or control or some other thing that's going on with them. And so the responses need to vary depending on context. You know, some have to be necessarily reactive, because the homeowner who's facing mounting fines and violation notices might need some quick intervention. They might need letters of support from landscape designers or wildlife biologists or neighbors, or even in-person visits from experts who can help explain things. And then over time, a more proactive and long-term educational approach can gradually introduce people to the concept. And that includes all kinds of stuff like native plant giveaways and demonstration gardens and some of these events that some of the community groups are holding now. And the education has to be multifaceted, because there's so many different cultural myths that play into these types of cases. And often an HOA board or lawyer will just throw the whole kitchen sink at a homeowner and then try to capitalize on these fear-based myths that native gardens are going to destroy property values, or wildlife gardens attract pests, or that native plants are messy and wild, or pollinator gardens are dangerous. And so we're going to talk about some of the realities behind these very often promulgated misinformed statements tonight. And there's still so much work to do, but as we talk through these difficult issues, I also just want us to keep in mind just how many positive outcomes are rippling out from Janet's case and from the passage of the Maryland law that the case inspired. It's given a lot of other states encouragement to start looking into this too. Most recently, Maine passed a low impact landscaping law as well that carries some of the same language as ours does in Maryland. HOAs can't require turf grass. They have to allow native plant and wildlife gardens. And then more advocacy groups are feeling empowered to approach HOAs now that they have that law behind them. There's villages in Colombia that are changing their architectural guidelines even to allow tree snags, which is a standing dead tree for wildlife, which is pretty amazing in an otherwise pretty manicured community. The Eastern Shore of Maryland, Adkins Arboretum is leading an initiative to reach out to HOAs because of the law and changing some of their practices. And we've heard from a number of individual homeowners who've been able to successfully make a citation go away because of the law. And it helped one of our panelists tonight do just that. And inevitably, some of these HOAs are going to be pushing back and looking for loopholes. And we also hear from people about those situations. And that's really why it's going to take all of us to keep going and keep working collectively on this, because the fight is not over. And in a lot of places, it's really just beginning. And now I'm going to pass it back to Renee to talk about some of the differences between the Maryland and Virginia laws. Renee, I'll just stop sharing, or do you want me to?
Oh yeah, go ahead. You can click through and we can see both Maryland and Virginia here. So we've got
Okay.
two states we're talking about tonight, Maryland and Virginia. So the first thing to know is that both really at their base are Dillon rule states. And that means that localities are restricted in what ordinances and taxes they can pass. The laws have to pass in Richmond, or in Virginia and Richmond first, and Annapolis and Maryland first, before they can apply to locales. But the interesting thing about Maryland is that they actually are also in part a home rule state, which means localities can sometimes pass their own rules. So if you're above a certain threshold in population, like Montgomery County and Prince George's County are, you can, those locales have their own ability to make their own rules. And in general, Maryland's been a bit more progressive than Virginia in environmental laws. They have a ban on foam, smart growth and planning laws that are really strong, and just recently passed the Forest Conservation Act. But in Virginia, we generally are a little bit, and I'm talking because I'm from Virginia, we're a little bit less progressive on our environmental laws. For homeowners associations, the Maryland Homeowners Association Act governs HOAs, and there's a similar kind of structure in Virginia. But it's interesting because in Maryland, the laws that Nancy was talking about, they are not necessarily restricted by the declarations in an HOA. Those are the governing documents. But in Virginia, so far, all the HOA related laws have been restricted by declaration. So there's just some differences in the way the laws work. So at this point, we've gotten a good introduction of where we are, and I want to make sure that you get a chance to meet our panelists as well. So with that, I'm going to actually let our panelists do an introduction of their own selves and what their story is. You've already gotten to hear a little bit from Nancy, so we'll dive right in with introducing you to Janet.
Thank you, Renee. And thanks for having me and having this panel tonight. It's such an important topic and it affects so many people. I've lived in Howard County, Maryland for more than 30 years, and my husband and I have nurtured an environmentally friendly garden for nearly 2 decades. We removed most of our turf grass lawn over several years and filled our garden with mostly native plants, but also some non-natives to benefit pollinators and provide food and shelter for wildlife. In 2017, our Homeowners Association insisted that we replace our garden with grass. The initial letter from the HOA requested that we perform seasonal maintenance. We responded that we had mowed, even though the little grass that we had was already mowed, and had pulled a few weeds. We also noted that we were gardening in an environmentally friendly manner. 2 months after the initial notice from the HOA, we received a cease and desist notice from the HOA attorney demanding that we remove our entire garden within 10 days and replace it with turf grass or face fines and a lawsuit. This led to a years-long battle that cost us our peace of mind and tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. We would later learn that this action had been initiated due to the complaints of one neighbor who lives next door to us. After working through the HOA process for nearly 2 years with no resolution in sight, we sued our HOA in 2019. Rather than allowing the case to proceed to court and be decided by a judge, they countersued us over the very same issues, which only served to raise the legal fees higher. We settled the case in December of 2020, retaining virtually all of our garden, with a 6-foot setback along the sidewalk where we planted Pennsylvania sedge, and along the complaining neighbor's side of our home where we agreed to a 3-foot setback. As it turns out, we already had a 3-foot setback and didn't have to make any changes there. Although we would have liked to proceed to court, if we had lost, the judge could have ordered us to pay the HOA's legal fees, which were over $100,000 at that point. In 2019, I contacted my state legislators and asked for assistance, and this was before we settled. They introduced legislation the following year, which was sailing through the legislature when COVID shut everything down. It was reintroduced in 2021 and received almost unanimous support. It became law on October 1st, 2021. According to the law, HOAs may not require turf grass and must allow low-impact landscaping, including biohabitat gardens, pollinator gardens, rain gardens, and xeriscaping. So that's all I have.
Thank you so much. Next up, we'll have Melinda just introduce herself.
Hey, my name is Melinda, and I live in Northern Virginia in an HOA. I'm here because 8 years ago or so, I planted milkweed in my yard, and the monarchs came. I started out with a small mailbox garden in what some people call the hell strip, because that's the only place in my yard that has sun. I started out slowly and just kept adding to it. After about 7 years, I received a letter from the HOA telling me that my landscaping wasn't approved and asking me to put in an application. So I did. It was completely rejected. They told me that I had to return the entire area back to turf grass. And long story short, I spent about 9 months advocating for my garden. And after many sleepless nights, tears, back and forths, legal threats, I succeeded in saving about half of my pollinator habitat. I was quite pleased with this, actually, until I received a letter from my HOA saying that I had to remove my Monarch Way Station and Xerces Society signs because, and I quote, no HOA would ever want to encourage wildlife in their front yard. I knew then that I needed to try to change things in Virginia. I had been so inspired by Nancy and Janet's work to create legislation. So a little over a year ago, I began working on doing the same thing here in Virginia, and luckily got the attention of Renee and Nature Forward, who have partnered with me to advocate for legal protections for conservation landscaping and HOAs here in Virginia. Also, as a result, I partnered with a friend to create a local chapter of a national nonprofit called Wild Ones, an educational and environmental advocacy group for native landscaping. That's in order to try to help provide folks in my area with help when they have problems with their HOA. Help you read your HOA docs or talk to you about what my experiences are. Come speak to your HOA board. I'm also running for my HOA board again to try to change my organization from the inside out. But I really don't want homeowners who just want to help out in the environment by planting some natives and some environmentally friendly landscaping to feel like they have to join their HOA board, or that their yards have to be perfect and wonderfully designed in order to avoid unwanted scrutiny. I really want to make sure that this type of landscaping becomes just as normal as the acres of turf grass that we are used to today. Thanks, Renee.
Thanks so much, Melinda. And next up, we'll have Manny Korean introduce himself.
Hello there. My name is Mani Korean. I am a biology professor, a nature lover, and a nature enthusiast, in addition to being an extremely, what I call myself, a dark green environmentalist. So my story is not very different from Janet's story, but a few twists here and there. I came to my community, single house community in Ellicott City in Maryland in 2016. And right away, based on what I've learned from my mom, who at 77, I think it's 77 years old, she still gardens like 6 hours a day. So I learned from her that garden is the only way to be happy, believe it or not. I agree with that, which is that I started my own garden. And right away, within a few months, of course, I put a little netting over them to keep the deer and the bunnies away. And I was told, well, you know what? There are rules in this community. A very friendly neighbor showed up and said there are rules in the community. I said, yeah, but I can't live without a garden. I mean, I can't live without flowers. So that I thought that would have been the end of the matter. In 2017, I got a notice saying that all the stuff that you're doing in the front yard is not approved. I got into a meeting with all the ARC, or the Architectural Review Committee members. I thought that was settled. They said, no, you have to comply with us. This is a garden that's not approved. So I went back to them and said, if you read the architectural guidelines, gardens do not need an application or approval. But I thought it was a bigger issue than just convincing a few people. I thought I needed to create more awareness, got into the board, faced stiff opposition right away. So much so that when I tried to bring in people of, who thought like me or had similar, sentiments about gardens, a lot of things happened during elections, which made it look like they were trying to steal the election. Anyway, matters didn't end there. A court case was brought against me. And boy, that was the most stressful day in my whole life, I must say. I've never been in a court system, but I decided, and this was a time before I knew about Janet's case, I decided I'm going to fight it on my own. But a good friend of mine, over the next 30 days or something, it was just, I would say sheer luck that she sent me a text saying, here's someone who is actually trying to get a legislation passed. And the rest is history. I fought all their legal documents, with every argument supported by every other argument from my side. It went into mediation, didn't end there. I said, I'm going to take it to the court. But that's when the bill got passed, the Maryland law, which made it easier for me. And the HOA wanted to withdraw the case. I said, no, I will have my day in court. The judge said, they have no case against you. The case has been dismissed with prejudice, meaning they cannot bring another case against me in the Maryland court system. So that's my story, but it doesn't end there, because now they brought in another case against me saying that my garden is not perfect. And the new law actually allows reasonable restrictions placed by the HOA on the homeowners. So the fight continues, but I'm hoping that I can help other people, support other people in their fights, and make sure that, the tyranny of the few is not affecting the many.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. And last but not least, Barbara Ryan.
Thanks, Renee. Hi, everybody. I'm Barbara Ryan. I'm owner and founder of Chainbridge Native Landscapes. And that's a native landscape design firm located in McLean, Virginia. My primary focus is helping clients transition from traditional to native and ecologically friendly landscapes. I firmly believe that native gardens are more beautiful, more environmentally beneficial, and of course more friendly to wildlife than traditional gardens, and the more the better. My clients include individual property owners as well as HOAs. The picture shown here, one is a playground garden area in an HOA, common area, and the other is an entryway for an HOA. I have designed, as you can see here, common areas at HOAs as well as gardens for individual HOA homeowners. I hold a master's degree in sustainable landscape design. I'm a certified Virginia horticulturist and a level 2 Chesapeake Bay landscape professional. I'm also a Fairfax Master Naturalist, and I'm very involved with community, environmental, and conservation policy issues. I serve on the board of the Virginia Native Plant Society as conservation chair, and in that capacity, I was very involved in the successful passage of 2 native and invasive plant bills in last year's Virginia General Assembly. Shown here on this page are a number of gardens, native gardens that I've designed for individual property owners. The one on the left is a naturalistic design. All the others shown here are front yard designs. That's it.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Thanks to all of our panelists for being here tonight, and for Nancy for hosting. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Nancy.
Thank you. I think I'll start with, because I see a question already about how much were Mrs. Crouch's legal fees. So I'll start with Janet, and kind of wanting to know, we get this question a lot, I think, why you actually decided to spend so much time and money fighting for your garden. And I'd like to hear from Nanny and Melinda too on that note.
Yeah, in response to the first question, we spent over $60,000 in our lawsuit and defending ourselves from the countersuit. We, of course, didn't go into this expecting to have to spend that much money, but it was over several years, and that's what it took. We decided, we kind of really felt like we didn't have a choice but to fight for our garden. We're in the middle of a mass extinction, and so we feel a responsibility to do what we can to support wildlife and to certainly not tear it down and exterminate the creatures that live in our yard. So that's why we fought, and that's how much we spent. And there's also a really significant emotional toll fighting something like this, as I know Melinda and Monty can attest to. People are in your yard taking pictures. It never ends, sort of the surveillance and the never knowing what's coming next, and which is why we ultimately decided to file the lawsuit, because we could not come to a resolution with our HOA, no matter how hard we tried.
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to know too, Monty, how did you decide, at what point did you decide that these conversations weren't going to go anywhere and you needed to take it to the next level? For other people who are dealing with this, how do you assess, when that avenue isn't going to work anymore and you have to actually start a fight or defend yourself?
Right. Yeah. So just to be clear, and unlike in Janet's case where she actually had to file a lawsuit, in my case, it was the other way around. They filed a lawsuit because all I did was basically ignored all their threatening emails and letters of notices of all violations. And so I guess in my situation, it was a decision whether I need to move forward in defending myself, or do I just comply with what they wanted to do. And I would say part of it is my personality. I'm a fighter by nature, and I don't give up. So for me, it was about, to be very frank, it was about weighing the pros and cons, as in what are the challenges of fighting it. Obviously, that meant that I would have to, go through the legal process involving a lawyer, which, again, just offhand, I would think that was not an option for me, because that would have cost too much money. And I just, on a whim, I must say, I said, no, this is a battle worth fighting, and let me see if I can fight it on my own. Because I thought, I never thought the ramifications would be so big, as in, and I never thought that I would get this, very pleasant help from Janet's case and the law being passed. But it was this idea that we have to fight this because they brought it on. So let me give it my best shot.
And the fact that you represented yourself is incredibly impressive. I don't know how you, what did it take for you to do that? To actually be your own lawyer?
Yeah, I can smile about it now, but those were very tense days, because I would wake up every day. Not that I don't wake up every day early morning, but I would make sure that the first 2 hours between 4 and 6 in the morning, I'm just doing legal research. I call up all kinds of people trying to find help. But at the end of the day, it was about doing my own stuff. I found out that Maryland allows you to do all kinds of legal documents online through the Odyssey system that they have, which was very convenient because I didn't have to do paperwork. So every communication with the other side's lawyer or the HOA's lawyer and anything else, I just could do it online. That was very helpful. But yeah, it's hard work, but like I always tell my students, if I can do it, so can you. So that's my advice.
Yeah, that's great. It's very inspirational. And Melinda, you too. I mean, you kind of were thrown into this situation, and it's have some similar aspects to your story. But in Virginia, it's been a little bit of a different trajectory, right? Do you want to speak to some of the differences there?
Yeah, so here in Virginia, the way the HOAs are laid out seems to be a little bit different. So that makes fighting some of these. I don't know what your experiences were in Virginia, but we actually did speak with a few. I'm sorry, in Maryland, we did speak with a few lawyers here in Virginia, and really was kind of bleak and dismal outlook is what everyone kind of talked to me. I actually spoke with a lawyer who tried to fight his own HOA on something that had happened to his property before he moved in, and he was unsuccessful, and he was just incredibly downcast, and was basically said to me I wouldn't even try. So that was incredibly disheartening to hear. And then
Yeah.
I had heard about all the money that the Crouches had spent, and we actually have a gentleman here in Virginia who fought his HOA and spent even more money, and did get some of it returned to him. He won his case, and so he did get some of his money returned to him, but he still spent tens of thousands of dollars. And my husband and I talked, and we agreed we can't spend our family's money on this. We're going to have to find another way. And because I was able to come to somewhat of a compromise that didn't involve taking everything out, that helped. So.
Mhm. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of, there's a certain point, I think, sometimes when there's an intractability of certain communities. You either have to get legal help or defend yourself legally, or take out your garden. So it's good that you didn't have to go fully either route, but the whole point of doing this legislation now is that others hopefully won't have to. And so I'm hoping we can talk about also the actual progress of getting the law started, or the legislation started in Virginia. But we have a good question coming up here from McCaffrey saying, what, if anything, have you found best to do about changing the minds, hearts of other HOA members toward eco-gardening, to change things from inside the HOA and community to favor this change? And of course, that's all about context. And we know of some people in other communities around the country who've managed to just sort of do this bit by education, again, with people who are more reasonable. I mean, Manny mentioned the tyranny of the few, and that's the problem with some of these situations, is that there's one or two people who can dominate for a long time. And Janet, I know also, she ran for the board, and I wondered if you could talk about how that helped and maybe didn't help. Too, you got access to some things, and could see the inner workings, but it didn't necessarily help you make change in the beginning.
No, it didn't. So I tried to do what you're told to do when you're in a situation like we've been in, put up signs, run for the board, try to talk to your neighbors about what you're doing. And so I did run for the board. In our community, there are always openings for the board. So it's not too hard to get on the board. But the people who are on it for a long time are the same, they've been there for years, and they have their own little coalition. We had a president who was in charge for over 10 years and was only recently voted out, but he essentially even said that he was refusing to take his name, not be the president anymore. I mean, there's so many machinations that happen in an HOA. So we passed out flyers to our neighbors to try to help them understand. But I guess what we found, we had hope all the way. It was even maybe over a year into the process, we had a hearing. And I remember thinking then, well, if we can just talk to these folks, face to face, and tell them about what we're doing, they'll understand. And we had this hearing, despite some of the really bad behavior by the lawyer, where he told us to shut up when we were talking about native plants and things like that. afterwards we felt pretty good because we felt like, we shared really good information with them. But we waited then another 9 months after that hearing to find out that it was the same demand to have our yard return to grass, take out our entire garden. So we realized at that point, and we kind of knew at the hearing also that the lawyer was really in charge in our community, and no matter what we did, it wasn't going to matter. He was the one calling the shots. He was really running what happened in our community rather than the board. So,
Right.
yeah, there are a lot of dysfunctional HOAs. I'm sure everyone is not as dysfunctional
Yeah.
as
But
ours.
you did learn by getting in the inner workings, you did learn they were spending $100,000 eventually, about $100,000 on fighting
Yeah,
a garden.
over time.
It's
Yeah,
an amazing
yeah.
thing. And I want to get to Barbara on this question of changing hearts and minds from the inside, because a lot of what you do has to do with helping people see the beauty of native plant gardens and incorporating sort of these elements that will make them familiar to people and things like that. So how do you go about that with your clients and when you're working in an HOA situation to try to create something that will be accepted by maybe a more rigid community?
Right. That's a great question. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of times in HOAs, particularly if you're talking about common areas, there's an HOA champion who has been doing the education, and they go into this wholeheartedly. Like when I have been hired by HOAs to do designs for common areas, they're already on board. And it's often the same with individual homeowners. They already know the landscape of the land, the whole issue. And so for them, it's a matter of balancing what they want to achieve with what might be acceptable in their particular neighborhood or HOA. And what I tell people is, think about the look and the aesthetics that you're trying to achieve. So a native garden can be it can be wild, of course, but it doesn't have to be too wild. And a native garden can also look incredibly formal, and it actually can blend in very well with traditional landscapes. So the homeowner really needs to kind of be thinking about this. What is the look you want to achieve? Because each of them, requires a different approach. And I also want to emphasize, nobody needs to hire a designer to do this. It really comes down to some very fundamental gardening kind of thoughts or, rules of thumb or something. There's two key things: plant selection and plant arrangement. So of course, with plant selection, you want to make sure right plant, right place, that's a given. But beyond that, you want to think about how the plants are growing. And many plants that are native are vigorous spreaders. So you want to understand what's the personality of the plants that you're choosing. And then, you want to be careful with the spreaders because they can be wilder and they actually just require more work to stay manageable. And on the other hand, you have native plants that grow in clump form. And those are my favorites to use with people who want to have a more formal look. There's a lot of wonderful clump forming native plants. I love grasses, switchgrass, little blue stem. I plant these profusely in front yards, and they can look quite formal, because then that gets to the other thing, which is plant arrangement. If there are ways that you can arrange the plants to make it look more formal or a little bit less wild while still being wild. So if you plant in masses, if you have, an area border, instead of planting, 15, 20 different native plants, which will create a more naturalistic look. But if it's in your front yard, maybe you can do it with 3 or 4 and plant them in masses, and it can be incredibly formal and striking with the same, very similar pollinator benefits. Maybe not as much biodiversity, but still better than what used to be there. And then the last thing in terms of plant arrangement is be very careful with tall plants. Make sure they're in scale with the size of your bed. Taller plants, and then put the taller plants towards the back if you have a back, shorter plants and ground covers in the front. So between these two things, plant selection, plant arrangement, you can really play around with it to achieve the look that you want, that you think will be acceptable in your HOA.
Okay, yeah. And how do you, I mean, the grasses are great because they really do support also overwintering bumblebees and things like that. How would you convince an HOA you need to leave those things up over the winter and do some of these things that don't just involve plant selection, but actually, you know, the decay and the fact that we need those fallen leaves and we need the stalks and the
Yeah.
dried grasses and such.
Buying into the maintenance is as important as buying into the garden. You want to have a native garden, then you're basically agreeing to follow my recommendations on how to maintain it, which means minimal cleanup in the fall, leave as much standing as you can. You might neaten it up a little bit, but do your cleanup in the spring. And I through pictures and whatnot, I tell people, I mean, in the wintertime, those standing grasses are just gorgeous. And the snow and
Yeah.
the frost is on them, and with the seed heads of all your native plants that are standing there too, it's beautiful.
Yeah. And so are there ways, I think, Monty, you were going to answer this question too about hearts and minds and changing minds in the HOAs. Are there ways to get people actually to recognize the beauty of those tall grasses and those, the things that are a little bit more wild in their eyes?
Right, and I kind of want to echo what Barbara said, which is at the end of the day, it's about where you want to be at. What is the personality of the garden that you want? Of course, my idea of a garden, my refuge, my sanctuary would be very different from your idea of a garden, and that's where you have to make that final decision. But if you are deciding that your garden needs to have a real sustainable, wildlife in your yard, then of course you might find a lot of resistance. And one of the ways I thought I could do it was to get into the board, and I did, but I found a lot of intrinsic, resistance to the idea of why would you have anything other than grass? I mean, one of the board members told me, why on earth would you ever have anything other than grass? So that could be one kind of resistance, but I think what is more common is we don't know anything else. I've heard so many of my neighbors say, hey, that's what they've always done. So if you have an idea, and I actually, one of the things I did is I created this social media group, something called WhatsApp. I have like 40 of my neighbors in that. And I frequently tell them, that just last few days back, I said, I got an idea from what Melinda's picture was, which is leave the leaves alone. And I went to the USDA website and they said, you have a whole article or, podcast about leave the leaves alone during fall. So I sent it out to my friends or my neighbors, and slowly you win their hearts and minds. I'll tell you what, 2016, when I first came to my community, I was the only one who had a yard with flowers. Now there are at least 20 gardens in my community. So it's a persistent effort, but continuous, campaigning, winning the hearts and minds is possible. And there are people who are ready to say, I don't care what the HOA's violation notice says. I'm going to keep my garden. So it can be done.
Yeah, you've got some more allies now. And in your second lawsuit that you're facing, are those people going to step up and in support? How do you see that? How do you see this going?
That just happened a week or so back. So I'm more relaxed now, but I think I might have more support this time around. I don't know if that translates into people trying to get into the board and saying, we need to stop this. Probably that's where it will ultimately end, where the board changes hands into the right kind of people who would say, let's not make it about what was right 40 years back. We need to move forward with that, with the idea of a garden sustainable practices.
And so, you mentioned the reasonable restrictions phrase or whatever it was in the Maryland legislation that says it's sort of an some HOAs are sort of seeing this as an out.
Mhm.
And when Janet and I first saw the language, we were worried about the vagueness of that. And we were told that's going to have to work itself out through the courts and through amendments. And so you might be the first one to challenge that, which would be great, because I know you can do it based on past experiences.
I knew when I read the law, or the parts of the law, that when they put in there, this is going to be one of those things my HOA would use against me. And but I was hoping that because my case was about, with prejudice, that means they cannot bring another case, they would not dare, but I guess they did. So we'll see.
Yeah. So we have a question from Carrie Murphy. I live in a large HOA in Maryland and have been an advocate for low impact landscaping. We do have success stories, but also some setbacks. Part one is their intent in the Maryland legislation regarding grass alternatives. Our HOA has interpreted the law and requires low impact landscaping to require native plants. This rules out some microclovers and other substitutes that may not be native but would be low impact. So that's the first question, and I think I can answer that because somebody that contacted Janet early on wanted to, after the law passed, was cited for her clover in her lawn, but she also has extensive gardens, and she was afraid they were going to come after those next. It just so happened that the Attorney General's office had come out with a letter defending clover as being acceptable under Maryland law. We can send you that letter if you want to have, an argument that you should be able to have clover in your grass. And that worked for this person. Her HOA backed right down. Part two, furthermore, does anyone have experience with weed ratios? For example, our HOA has penalties if turf contains over 25% weeds. This does not seem to be covered in the law. Okay, so yeah, the only thing I know of is the clover situation. I don't know, Monty and Janet, if you know of anything else that speaks to that. Monty, you just raised your hand.
Yeah, so for me, I think again, it probably has to go through the court system to define it, because it's not defined by the law itself. For me, the important thing is, how do we define what a weed is? Because I think that's something that needs to be interpreted, which is, your weed might be my favorite grass or my favorite, clover. So that's something, again, it's a gray area, and that's, I think, what HOAs use all the time when they say it should be clear of debris. What do you define debris? Because my HOA, our guidelines, or the Architecture Review Committee's guidelines, is that your garden should be free of debris. Now, how do you define free of debris? Would that be every single leaf there or every single twig there? So there's a lot of ambiguity in how we interpret these HOA guidelines or covenants and whatnot. So a lot more work needs to be done. But I think at the end of the day, we can never get to a decision as to this is what we define as a weed. It ultimately ends up being what is acceptable to the general community. But how do we get there? That's a long process.
Yeah, and there's many misconceptions, even with that letter I just mentioned from the Attorney General's office. It talks about how clover is acceptable, but then it talks about benefits of clover, and it says that it crowds out violets, which I tried to talk to them about taking that out of their letter, because it's defeating our purpose here. But yes, so we have a lot of education to do. But in terms of vague language, I know Melinda has faced a situation where her HOA added some new language, right? That's very vague and subjective.
Yeah, so they did add some new language in a process of some other things that, and again, it's not defining anything, right? It's using the word weeds, it's using the words maintain, and your definition of maintain and my definition are different. And I think um, unfortunately, I think the only way to really work on that one, like you said, is education. And I'm on my architectural review board now, and we are going through our guidelines one by one. And one of the things that I do is and rather than trying to argue about what's a weed or not, we came over this clover one, and I said, listen, some people grow clover on purpose because it's a nitrogen fixer. Then you don't have to fertilize, and it brings the nitrogen back into the soil by itself. And that was acceptable for that group of people. So it's just a slow, kind of painful progress in that way.
Yeah, and maybe just being face to face at every meeting like that kind of gets them to start to go ahead.
And I was going to say, I think that it sounded like some of the problems that maybe you guys had with the Crouch's Yard was because it was during COVID and you couldn't really talk to anybody face to face. And that's one of the things that my certain people in my HOA were trying to do, which is to keep me from being able to have these conversations. I was told that there was nothing that I could possibly say in these meetings that would change anybody's mind. But lo and behold, when I actually got into the meeting with the entire group of people, there was really only one person that was resistant to what I was doing. And that's how we were able to come up with a compromise. But if I had been unable to go and speak with, which they tried incredibly hard to keep me from doing. We almost had a yelling match right before the meeting. And I would never have been able to advocate for myself, and that never would have happened. So I think the face-to-face, knowing who your neighbors are, and trying to make connections with neighbors, which, it's, again, slow progress. And sometimes it feels disingenuous, which I didn't really like about it, because I'm almost trying to be a politician and currying favor.
Yeah, and I'm a subject of getting, neighbor, just getting some allies in the community. I mean, for people who are dealing with this for the first time, how do you look for allies? And I think that can be really challenging when you feel like you're under attack already and you don't know who's coming, who doesn't like your garden.
Yeah, we have a Facebook group which is very active. Not everybody's on there, and so I went on Facebook and kind of rallied the troops. I invited everybody to come to an informational session at one of the meetings. I wasn't focused just on the gardening issue at the time. I was talking about a lot of stuff. And also one of the things I did is I walked around my neighborhood and found other people that had native plants. Sometimes you can tell just by looking in their yard that they're going to be, like-minded. And then, my next door neighbors were great. All the people who I knew in person were great. It was that face-to-face, trying to go to those community events that are happening. That was the only way I was able to do it.
Yeah. So we have a question here for Janet and Melinda. I think, did anyone try and contact the Community Association Institute? And if so, did you receive any help?
I did not try to contact the Community Association Institute here in Virginia. There's, again, I when speaking to the lawyers, was really discouraged that there was anything. The way that my rules were written, basically, it wasn't really any wiggle room. We I don't know. We have spoken with the Community Association Institute as far as trying to create the new law, and have gotten a little bit of help there. But I went to a training class with the CAI, and that's not really what they're there for. They're not really. That's the impression that I got. They're not really there to help homeowners, right? They're there for board members. They're there for the management folks.
Yeah, and I know in Virginia, it was a different situation when they were reached out to for the law, for support of the law. But in Maryland, Janet, do you want to mention what happened
sure.
in Maryland?
In Maryland, our legislator worked with someone who is a property management person in Maryland, And he worked with CAI and she worked with CAI to get their support of the bill in Maryland. So they actually wrote a letter in support. As far as before that, as an individual, I knew that the law firm that represented the HOA, the head of that firm had previously been the president of CAI and was not at all in favor of what we were doing. So on an individual level, I don't think it would have been effective, but it definitely helped in the legislative process because the right people knew who to contact, and they provided their support.
Yeah, and so what is the prospect? Somebody, Carol asks, for changing the law in Virginia, and I thought maybe both Barbara and Melinda could talk about this, because Barbara, you worked on legislation in Virginia that was successful related to native plants and invasive plants. And what are the trickier issues with this one?
You want me to try that first? I think on this one, first of all, there's the tricky issue here kind of really relates to property rights, and whether you're talking about the property rights of the homeowner or the property rights of the HOA. And so it's a little hard to predict exactly how it's going to play out. On the positive side, the General Assembly should be very favorable to anything involving native plants. So I'm kind of excited about that. And so the process itself, though, is it's really it's pretty intense. I mean, a lot happens very quickly. The bill gets dropped, and then it goes to committee. And right now, I'm not sure we have a really good handle on which committee it's going to go to, how it's going to drop, when it's going to drop, which committee it might go to, and how that might affect it. So what I found last year was that, certain bills, boy, they went out there and they died a really quick death. And others had staying power. We were really successful with the two bills that we got through last year related to native and invasive plants. And that was largely a function, I think, of just, a lot of communication about those bills once they were in committee and they were up for votes, getting people to write letters and figure out how to navigate that LAS website.
Yeah. And so hopefully that will help pave the way. At least people are more aware of these issues now. As the more this type of legislation comes up. Melinda, I know you had been collecting stories of a lot of cases of people in these situations. Do you want to talk about that? And is that part of the case you're making with the legislators you're working with?
Absolutely. We're gathering stories from folks that have had, eerily similar situations, some of the stuff that we've already talked about. Folks, to go back to that weeds thing, people who, you talked earlier about the divide between people who just are uneducated and those who are unwilling to change, right? So there's going to be a lot of folks that are unwilling to change, and so that they're deliberately misusing language to use, they're calling them native weeds, in capital letters and things like that. Folks that we have someone who was working on a living shoreline, is actually well educated and an advocate of living shorelines, and was being told by their HOA that they had to cut everything down, which actually turns out is against the law, and they've been stopped. The HOA has been stopped in their tracks by the law, and so was really great to hear. But it did take that homeowner quite a bit of work to get to a point where someone was able to help them. So yes, people like that who have been through this, we were collecting stories, and we're going to ask them if they'd be willing to share their information or even possibly testify in the future. And then the other thing is, kind of working on what's the number of HOAs that have wording already, in place against, for example, requiring turf grass, which I know was one of the things that was in the Maryland bill, which I think was so important, is that requiring turf grass is can't be allowed because of all the implications of that. So.
Right. And so that person who was able to fight back on the living shoreline that they had created, it makes me think of, this need to get the word out to as many of our colleagues in this field as we can, that they have to if whatever they can do to step up and help people in these situations. I mean, what are some ways that we can make them more aware, and also help homeowners reach those people who can provide that kind of support and that kind of guidance? I know you started Wild Ones
Mhm.
partly for that reason.
Yeah, we have a survey that's circulating. I think one of the problems that you have is that a lot of times you end up preaching to the choir. And so I think that's a question that really we've really been struggling with. I know that when your story got written up in the New York Times, I think it was, it just, from my perspective, it kind of went viral. I had 15 different people send it to me within a week, because they knew of what I was going through. So I can't, other than passing it through word of mouth, because for example the living shoreline issue, she reached out to me through another advocacy group, in that maybe the Rappahannock Friends of Rappahannock or something like that, and I actually didn't know of the law. She didn't. I tried to walk her through her HOA docs and kind of and look at everything, and I said I think you're going to have to get a lawyer. But she was able to find some, and I actually don't know how that happened, right? So that's exactly what you're saying, is how do we make sure these people get to the right place? And I've got to be honest with you, I haven't found the perfect solution yet for that.
Okay, yeah. What, Monty, were you gonna say something about that, or Barbara? As a biology professor?
Oh, okay. I was thinking that Barbara was going to pitch in. No worries. Yeah, I mean, I guess the idea is to create awareness, and you go one step at a time. And what I'm doing in my community may be very low scale in terms of the overall impact, but what I'm thinking is over time. Again, this is the long fight, in my opinion. So over time, people are going to change their minds, because we see the writing on the wall. As Janet said, we're going through a mass extinction, on the planet. So if we don't make amends, if we don't change our mentality to to what we thought was right, like turf was the way to go. And by the way, the idea of a turf grass is not that old. It's just post World War II. If you look at the history, it's just post World War II that this whole idea of a yard should be just turf grass. And again, there are vested interests in promoting that, but we don't want the entire United States. Another fact is turf grass is the largest per capita, in terms of the number of acreage. Turf grass is the largest in the US, not more than corn and wheat. So we don't want that reality out there to persist. We have to change that, and for that we have to go one step at a time. Individuals, communities, states, country itself. It's going to be a long fight, but for me, the advice to everybody is, if you are in an HOA, read the documents, because in my case that was very helpful. I can actually go and tell you what is on page 5, because I read through every page, and that's when I knew that sometimes they just make things up. They say, oh, it's in the cabinet. I say, no, it's not in the cabinet. They say, oh, it's in the guidelines. I say, no, that's not what the guidelines says. So sometimes it's a fear among people that, hey, why do I get into trouble with the HOA and that's the fear they use. So we have to educate people, create that awareness, and move forward.
Yes, that is such a good point, and I want to talk about that some more. The fear and the intimidation, where oftentimes they don't have a leg to stand on, but people don't realize that, and they don't realize that they can just at least start with doing a little bit of homework, right? And looking through what actually the regulations are in their community. I wanted to put that question to Barbara too, about how we can get more landscape designers involved in helping with this, and horticulturists. But we also have a related question from Allie. For Barbara, I'd love to hear about how you've seen the landscaping industry change since you started your company, And also your experience with finding new clients. Have they tried native landscaping already? Are they interested in maintaining their gardens after you have designed and installed them? I find many people I speak with are intimidated by the maintenance of an actual garden in the standard landscape. So it's a lot of hand holding, I imagine.
Yeah. Well, a couple parts to this question. So I would say definitely over the last 5 years, there's been really significant growth in the demand for native landscaping. I mean, awareness is definitely growing very rapidly. I think around here in Northern Virginia, like Plant Nova Natives just does a phenomenal job getting and, working with traditional nurseries and making sure that people understand, get it with the plant labels and things like that. So it's grown tremendously. For most of the clients who I work with, I don't need to educate them. They already know. They might have just bought a home with older landscaping. They want to rip it all out, or they want to gradually transition. So they get it already. They're just either too busy or it's too big of a project for them to take on. And so they really want somebody to hold their hand, give them a detailed plan and install it for them. And then, yes, you're absolutely right. The maintenance, and actually, I mean, you can talk about maintenance of a native garden. What I really look for when I think about what clients are likely to be the most successful with this kind of an endeavor is our homeowners that have an active and involved relationship with their garden. And they don't think of it as maintenance. They think of it as editing or ongoing design. They enjoy walking around their property with a pair of clippers and a weeder, and they just do it regularly. That is absolutely hands down the most successful type of native gardener, because you have to do that editing to keep it looking nice and manageable. If you're relying on landscape crews to do it, usually they don't come frequently enough, or they're not informed enough to do it. So I work with installers, I do designs, and I work with independent installers who understand sustainable landscape designs. And a lot of my clients end up having them come, not weekly like the traditional ones do, but like 4 times a year, maybe 3 times a year. And they know they do the heavy weeding in the summer, and they do a little bit of fall stuff, and then they do the main spring cleanup. Those are sort of the big pieces that people struggle with. The weeding comes July, August, and the spring cleanup. So you can find people to help you with that. And then, like I say, it's just really helpful if people like to do it themselves in between those occasional visits.
Have you had anybody who's been inspired enough by what's happening in the garden to start to learn how to do those things themselves?
Yeah, absolutely.
If they get excited.
Absolutely. But honestly, a lot of people are just really time constrained and sometimes physically constrained. It can be a lot of work. I do almost all the maintenance in my property, which is almost 2/3 of an acre. And it's backbreaking. It's a lot. So even I occasionally have my friendly crew come in and help me out.
So I want to talk about the myths, the fear factor, these things that sometimes an HOA will come after you with that aren't actually true. And so Janet, what comes to mind first is the property values argument, because you have a really good story. They say property values are being decreased by a garden, but they have no backup for it. Oh, you're muted.
This is obviously not a scientific study, but my neighbor, so my one next door neighbor is the one who complained. My other next door neighbor moved last fall and received the highest amount that anybody in our neighborhood had ever gotten for their home. And a lot of the realtors who walked by, people who were looking at the house, commented on our garden, said how much they enjoyed it, wished they had a green thumb too. And then my neighbor who lives kitty corner across the street sold her house this spring, and she got an even higher price than my next door neighbor. So just anecdotally, in my neighborhood, people who live closest to me have not had a reduction in the prices of their homes. It didn't reduce their property value at all.
Yeah, and also this idea that native plants are messy and going to attract quote unquote pests. And does anybody want to speak to those two things? We had quite a lot of arguments in Janet's case against that, one of which was that she backs up to a forest. And of course there are snakes, of course there are bats, of course there are all kinds of creatures. Barbara, you go.
Yeah, I love to talk to people about how native gardens promote a diversity of beneficial insects. And so people who are concerned about mosquitoes and they want to bring in Mosquito Joe, and I say, explaining to them why not to do that. But more importantly, if you have a native garden that's flourishing, you're going to have damsel and dragonflies and things that eat mosquitoes, and you'll have just this diversity of beneficial insects that will mean you won't have to be using all that stuff as much, at least.
Right.
And so, yeah, anyway, I think that often helps, and that's a very important part of it. I also, yes, the frogs. Personally, I downplay the snakes because I'm not, but yeah, if you live near a forest, you're gonna, like I do, you're gonna occasionally see them. And
right, and same type of, and they're there anyway, whether we know it or not. They're
right.
Snakes are so ubiquitous, but they're also doing that predator prey thing that you mentioned, eating mice and things like that. So that's great to hear that it's actually resonated with people when you've talked to them. What about you, Melinda? Did you face any of those things in your citations?
No, that was not brought up. It is a common theme in my neighborhood. I hear people asking. Actually, I have kind of made myself a name to be the lady that you call if you've got a snake in your garage, so that I can escort it out for you, right? But that's not something that came up. But I think that could be in part because my neighborhood is surrounded on three sides by different forests, and I think that a lot of that's just expected for us in our particular area. So I think that we might have a little bit of a different case, but I think the important thing is, again, is education, right? Because you're talking about, when people are talking about, usually it's rats, right? Or animals getting into your home. And so I think it's important to help people understand that the food web, as you were saying earlier, is a really important part of keeping all of those things in checks and balances. It's when you have an unhealthy ecosystem that you're going to have these animals coming into your home for food, or an excess of one particular population. But again, it's just education and advocacy, and that is lengthy and tiring.
Yes. Yeah, it sure is. And the idea that bees are going to sting is also a very ubiquitous comment. And as we know, most native bees are solitary, and it's not like bringing a honeybee hive into your landscape. So there's so many things myths we need to keep breaking down. But so someone asked, and we get this question a lot, does HB 322 apply only to properties in HOA communities? Because Harford County, Maryland requires meadows on properties under certain acreage to be maintained at 6 inches, or the county comes in and mows and thus eradicates benefits to wildlife. Yeah, that's terrible. And so Kirsten Hoffman, who's with Green Towson Alliance, hi Kirsten. She answered that question, and they are working to change the weed ordinance in Baltimore County. And so, yeah, unfortunately, it does not apply to the weed ordinances, which are better in some counties and worse in others. But one bit of really neat news that I think we should build on is that Minnesota recently Minnesota recently passed a law that's like this law, except it applies to weed laws. It supersedes all of the local weed laws. And so it doesn't apply to HOAs, but it applies to anybody just living in a regular community and who's subject to weed inspection agencies. And that requires the counties to allow wildlife gardens. And so that should be our next move here. So let's see what other questions we have. There's McCaffrey asked, do you have a list of clump forming natives that you mentioned, Barbara, flowers, grasses, etc. I started with some that are spreaders, and oh my, the bees love it, but it's too.
So I'm actually not aware of an actual list, but I think if you study some of the plant books, native plant books, you'll usually find that in the description. If they are clump type growers, that'll usually be described. And so you could put a list together yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really liked the Planting in a Post-Wild World talked about those sociability personalities, like you mentioned, of plants and how they spread. And Benjamin Vogt at Monarch Gardens, you can find it online. He's done quite a few blogs on design and kind of breaks down in some of the different species that you can mix together like this and how they spread. So yeah, so I think, just in general, one of the things that I always keep coming back to is that there's really was no playbook for any of this until you guys, the three of you, Melinda and Janet and Monty, in different ways started creating one. And so, I mean, what's the very first thing someone should do when they get that initial violation letter? We talked about, Monty brought up, you need to look at your guidelines to make sure they even have a leg to stand on. Once you find that out, what's the next step?
I mean, if you find out that they don't have a leg to stand on, then I would just say reply. Actually, there is a Wild Ones has a webinar on what to do, and one of the first things that she says as a former city lawyer is just respond and say, can you please show me? Actually, the onus is, she says very clearly, the onus is on them to show you the language. So ask them, I'm sorry, can you please show me the language where this is in what document and then I'd say, once you get to the point that the problem with the HOA documentation is that depending on what level it is, it may or may not be mutable. They may actually not even be able to allow you to have a variance. So I think that's the next thing is unfortunately is educating yourself about what level of documentation it's in and whether there's any wiggle in the room there. Often it'll say exceptions may be granted on a case-by-case basis or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, and then it comes to, if there is a possibility for wiggle room, is taking some time to go to them and explain what's happening and what you're doing. And the mistake that I think, a couple of the mistakes that I made was explaining too much, too long, too much information, just, I would say succinctly. And then the other thing is finding someone who can come and maybe speak to your HOA board that doesn't live in your neighborhood, that isn't you, a subject matter expert. And that's another mistake that I would say that I made was by trying to advocate for myself from the very beginning.
Okay, so, and you also have talked in the past about knowing your audience.
Yes. Yeah. That was a really tough one for me because everywhere you read, they say pull in that pollinator. Right? Everyone's really interested in saving the pollinators right now, save the bees, right? So calling it a pollinator habitat is immediately going to evoke a positive response from folks, but it had the exact opposite effect in my case. And so probably taking some time to go in and again, speaking to them in person. Part of my situation happened during COVID too, and I was unable to attend. And that very first two meetings that happened, I was unable to attend. So you can kind of gauge when you're there, right? What's the response that you're getting? But honestly, I think that's one of the tough things is how will you know? How will you know that they're going to respond? But that is an important piece of it, right?
Right. And I know Janet, you found out really quickly. I mean, you went at it anyway from every angle, but I think and had hope, right? But I think you found out really quickly they didn't care about pollinators or the environment, right?
No, I mean, in fact, my initial response to them, I'm sorry, my cats are fighting, so there's a little noise in the background. My initial response to them was, it did indicate that it was an environmentally friendly garden, and I had no idea that that would come back to haunt me. They, in the discovery process in our lawsuit, they wanted to know what environmental organizations we belong to, as if that was a bad thing. They were going to use against us. It was just really, but we knew, I mean, we had hope because we weren't connecting directly with the board members, but we actually, Melinda, were not allowed to. I tried to connect with them, but I was told that I couldn't, just kind of share information. And I was told that I had to go through the management company, that I was not allowed to speak to the board members about this. So, you know, there are just lots of different tactics that HOAs use. And so you can do everything that you're supposed to do and try to do and meet with people. But if they won't meet with you, they won't speak to you. There's, you know, sometimes you don't have a lot of other choices.
So I just realized we hadn't really talked about the cues to care concept. And do you want to mention that, Barbara, and anyone else who's implemented that too?
Sure. So cues to care, that's a term that has been adopted pretty broadly. And, you know, it's really about making sure that your garden looks intentional, which I think is really important if it's in your front yard, if it's in an HOA and people are going to be looking at it. You want to make sure that your garden borders and your edges are really well defined. You can define garden borders with turf by having that nice cut. You can define it with stone. Some of the pictures I had, some of the work I've done, you know, I've used walls, I've used river rock, but you want to make sure it doesn't like bleed into the turf and look like you just kind of stopped mowing. And so it's about clean edges, but it's also, I think cues to care is also about doing that editing, that garden editing, light pruning, going around with your clippers and just making sure that some things don't get too tall. Doing that, they call it the Chelsea chop for really tall growers in May or June. Cut them off at 1/3 and let them just grow bushier. So all of those are just things to make it look neater and intentional.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, just to get back to some of the more positive aspects, I think, Mani, you mentioned recently how much people come by and admire the nature in your garden. And Janet has had that experience too with kids in the neighborhood. So can you talk about that?
Me? You're asking?
Oh, for Mani. Yeah, for Mani. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the educational or the awareness campaign that you're running, even without your knowledge or without your intention of doing that. It's just that kids come, and I've told you the story about, you know, my honeysuckle would get so many hummingbirds humming around them that it's not a news for my kids anymore. But the kids in the neighborhood, they just come around and say, "Oh, I see a hummingbird there." I say, "Yeah, stick around and you might see a few more." And the monarch butterflies on my milkweeds. And I've actually shown it to the kids in the neighborhood, you know, the pupa, the chrysalis, for the monarch butterfly. So all these, you know, you're not trying to impress them, but you know, they spread the word out. The kids will tell their parents, "Hey, I saw that in Mani Uncle's garden, but we don't have it." So they start creating their own gardens, and they feel a little more comfortable that now that people know about my story, they feel a little more comfortable that, hey, we can do this and the HOA won't come after us. So that's the awareness that you create over time. You know, people come by and stop at my garden and say, "I really like the way your garden looks different," as in it's not the turf grass like other gardens have. So things like that, makes you feel like you are on the right path of educating the community towards a better
Yeah.
future.
Yeah. And Melinda and Janet, have you had neighbors like that who are responding?
Yeah, I mean, all the way through these many years that we've had our garden, we've had a lot of people that come by just to see it and to see the butterflies. They bring their kids. The kids like to come by. They walk by every day. They see what's new. They talk about the different flowers. So we've really enjoyed that. And we did have a lot of kind of what I call quiet support for our garden in our community. But people were afraid to speak up because they were afraid they would be targeted by the HOA too. But
And
we
now you have a
also,
new president.
that's what I
New
was just going to
president.
say. So we also, on a happier note, we do have a new president of our HOA who's planting meadows in the common areas, native trees all around the community. So it's taken a turn for the much better in Beach Creek in Columbia, Maryland. So really, really excited about that.
So I think we're close to coming up on time. Are there other things that we didn't get to that we wanted to talk about? Nobody has. Okay, so let's see if we missed anything over in the questions. Are you aware the state grounds in Annapolis are organically maintained? From Veronica. Yes, that is fantastic, and we should promote that more. And I think that's all for those questions. So I don't know if Renee, if you want to.
Nancy, can I interrupt? Someone had asked a
Yes.
question about the pre-World War II
Oh,
garden.
yes. Thank you.
And I actually
Mhm.
put the link from the Smithsonian Institute talking about what was normal pre-World War II. I mean, if that's sufficient, I can actually go a little bit more about that again, just to give you
Yeah.
how did yards look like. Yards were mostly kitchen gardens or vegetable gardens, and people had, believe it or not, farm animals in their yards. Not that I'm advocating for that, but that was your normal regular yard. It is just the post World War II, the community development, the private, developments of communities brought this idea of
Yeah.
yard being a place where you barbecue, and nothing wrong about that, but that brought in the idea of yards where you have grass and then turf grass, and then that became, for instance, as I mean, as late as in the 50s and 60s, they would sell turf grass seeds with mix of um, what is that? The
Clover and
clover seeds. Yes.
yeah,
Now
violets
clover is
sometimes.
considered to be a weed, so so that's
Yeah.
it's not been a long time since we had like normal sustainable gardens, and now we're looking at it as a weed. So,
I
but
wanted
hopefully we'll change things.
I wanted to throw in there about the maintenance. I know that Barbara is really correct about especially if you want to maintain natives in a formal landscaping, it can be a lot of work. But one of the things that I would like to see us work toward is the green mulch, right? Right now that, that is seen as messy, right? But you can do this gardening. You can let the plants take care of themselves, not completely. You still have to edit. You still have to clean up the weeds that sneak in, right? But it is possible to have a much lower maintenance. The problem is it just doesn't look like what everybody expects us to look. So that's the direction we need to go, I think.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for bringing up the green mulch. It's in that for anybody who hasn't worked with that yet. That's ground cover plants that are native, and also, herbaceous plants could be taller too and considered ground cover. But just instead of using mulch around trees and around all the plants in your garden, making a matrix of plants to cover the ground instead, and so much better for wildlife. And native bees to nest in there, ground nesting bees and things like that. So great point. So yeah, I think we're just about ready for the wrap up, Renee.
That sounds great. I hope everyone on the Zoom tonight can give a big round of applause. I know we won't be able to hear it, but we're really appreciative to have Nancy host this great panel discussion with all of our panelists today. Thank you so much for everybody's time. And just before we leave, I just want to share some upcoming things that we have. with Nature Forward. So coming up in January, we have our Naturally Latinos conference. This is going to be 2 virtual days on Wednesday and Thursday, the 24th and 25th. And then the 3rd day on the 27th will be an in-person day in Silver Spring, Maryland. Please come if you haven't been to this conference. It's fantastic. There'll also be some optional field trips on Saturday and Sunday, and registration will open in early December. And then, if you have any questions, I think you have my email address from hopefully from some reminders that we had sent out. And if you don't, I'll be sending a follow-up email next week at some point with the recording of this and with a bunch of resources that Nancy and all of our panelists have pulled together for you. Some of them may be answering some of the questions for resources that have been asked in the Q&A, but also some other ones that might have been discussed today. So thank you everybody again for your time.
Thank you, everybody.